Well, good afternoon, everyone. I'm Walter Mugden. I'm a member of the EPA Alumni Association, and I'm a former Deputy Regional Administrator with EPA Region 2. I'll be the moderator for today's program, which is Lead in Drinking Water and the Newark, New Jersey Experience. Our first presenter is going to be Eric Bernison. Eric is Director of the Standards and Risk Management Division in EPA's Office of Groundwater and Drinking Water in headquarters. He's going to start our discussion with an overview of the lead and copper rule improvements, a package of regulatory amendments that was promulgated just last month on October 8th. The second part of our program will be given by Christine Ash. Christine is the Deputy Director of the Water Division in my old region, EPA Region 2. She'll describe the extraordinary city, county, state, and federal partnership that enabled Newark, New Jersey to avoid becoming another Flint, Michigan, after alarming levels of lead in drinking water were found in a number of Newark homes. Lead in drinking water is a problem that has, and a concern that's been around since the time of the Roman Empire. In the first century BCE, the famous Roman architect and engineer Vitruvius urged that lead not be used for water pipes. His advice was ignored, and here we are 2,100 years later, and lead water pipes are still widely used today. However, here in the US, the era of lead pipes may finally be drawing to a close, as you'll hear from our speakers, particularly Eric, as he talks about the new rules and some of the funding that's out there for getting rid of lead pipes. And it's particularly fitting that we're presenting this program today because we're just about a month away from the 50th anniversary of the Safe Drinking Water Act, which was signed into law on December 16th, 1974. As a reminder, we are recording this program, and as always, the recording will be posted on our EPA Alumni Association website. There'll be a time for Q&A at the end of the program, but if you have any questions along the way, please feel free to put them in the chat. Please note, however, that we will not be discussing nor taking any questions about how the incoming administration may choose to manage the drinking water program or any other program. And with that, Eric, the virtual podium is yours.
Thank you, Walter. I want to thank you, and I want to thank the EPA Alumni Association for the opportunity to talk today about a really important, significant announcement that the agency made last month on October 8th. Actually, the announcement was made by President Biden in Milwaukee, where he announced the promulgation of the final lead and copper rule. And then that lead and copper rule was then subsequently published in the Federal Register on October 30th. So I'll be taking us through some slides. Patricia, if you wouldn't mind putting those slides up on the presentation, and I'll be talking us through those. If you could put it in the slideshow mode. Great. Thank you, Patricia. So as I said, the final lead and copper rule improvements were just recently promulgated, and it's a real pleasure to talk to you today. Patricia, if you could go to the next slide. I want to acknowledge that I was indeed scrolling through the attendees, and I see that there are a number of people that are very familiar with this phenomena of lead in drinking water, as I noticed that there are a number of past EPA employees who've worked on various versions of the lead and copper rule, but just on the off chance that there's some of you that aren't familiar with lead in drinking water, I'm going to talk a little bit through this graphic. So lead in drinking water irreparably harms the health of children. It disproportionately impacts lower income communities and communities of color. I mentioned children, but this also has adverse impacts on adults. What we know is that lead service lines, those legacy lead pipes that connect the water main in the street to the household, which were commonly installed in the earlier part of the latter century, in the mid part of the latter century, have exposed generations of Americans to health harming lead, and they're going to continue to do so as long as they're present and as long as they are the means by which drinking water is conveyed into those homes. We think that there are somewhere up to 9 million homes that are connected to water mains through these lead pipes. Most of those are lead service lines, and we know that those pipes, those lead service lines pose an ever-present risk to
the thing is
health and well-being.
You have
Okay.
multiple
I think if we could ask everybody to mute themselves, that would be great. So could we go to the next slide, Patricia? Thank you. So our key messages have been that the LCRI strengthens the nationwide requirements to protect the public from lead in drinking water, and these advancements are common sense, they're achievable, and they're built by actions that have been taken by many states and cities. And my colleague will talk to you about some of the actions taken in Newark recently. The final rule establishes additional requirements to better protect the communities from lead in drinking water by, in addition to removing lead service lines, by locating the legacy lead pipes, improving the tap sampling, lowering the action level, strengthening the public health protection through filter requirements, and improved communication. Next slide, Patricia. So again, the key provisions of the final LCRI are the requirement to replace lead service lines under the system's control within 10 years, locating existing lead pipes, which is necessary to be able to do that, strengthening the tap sampling, lowering the threshold for taking action, the action level, supporting reducing exposure at home, and communicating more transparently and frequently. I'll talk about each of these topics in the subsequent slides. So next slide, Patricia. All right, so when it comes to the lead service line replacement, as I've mentioned, where the lead service lines are present, they represent the greatest source of exposure to lead in drinking water. So water systems are going to be required to replace their lead service lines. And this is important, the lead service lines under their control within 10 years. There are some limited circumstances, particularly systems with a high proportion of lead service lines amongst their service connections, that will be provided additional time to complete the lead service line replacement. That's a small percentage. We estimate that the vast majority of water systems are going to replace their lead service lines within 10 years or less. Systems are going to have to create a service line replacement plan. That plan is going to be due 3 years from now. And they're going to have to make that replacement plan publicly available. That plan is going to identify a number of things, including any state or local laws that prevent them from having access to the private portion of the line. It also will require them to identify ways that they will help the disadvantaged portions of people in their communities pay for achieve lead service line replacement, and the degree to which they'll offer financial assistance in replacing the lead service lines. By replacing the lead service lines, we know we're going to be removing the greatest source of lead in those communities where those lead service lines exist. Next slide, Patricia. So as I mentioned, locating lead service lines is going to be one of the most important steps to take to assure that they can be replaced both efficiently and equitably. So water systems have already been required to submit an initial inventory of their service lines that actually was due under the prior regulation. We didn't extend the deadline or change that deadline. We notified states and water systems when we embarked upon the action of revising the lead and copper rule that we would plan to maintain that deadline. So that deadline has come, and water systems have been required to submit that lead service line inventory and to make it publicly available. And what we're requiring under the LCRI is that water systems are going to have to regularly update their inventories and identify all of the materials that are unknown. So the current inventories that they've submitted can indicate that there are unknown lines in there. By the end of the compliance period, or by the end of the 10-year replacement period, the water systems will have to have identified all of those unknowns. And that new baseline inventory is going to be due 3 years from now. Thanks, Patricia. Next slide. Okay, so the tap sampling. So we have made significant changes to the tap sampling requirements that have been informed by practices that are already being used by states like Michigan. And what it's going to require is that rather than right now, water systems are only required to take a first liter sample after having sat stagnant for 6 hours in a variety of locations. And the LCRI is going to require that water systems prioritize sampling at homes with lead service lines, and that they collect both a first and a fifth liter sample at the sites with lead service lines. And then they use the higher of those two values to determine whether or not the system what the system's 90th percentile level is and whether or not that system is exceeding the action level. We think this is going to better identify those systems, particularly with lead service lines that are experiencing elevated levels of lead, so that additional actions can be taken. Next slide. So I mentioned the action level. So what we are doing with the LCRI is lowering that action level, which currently is at 15 micrograms per liter or parts per billion, down to 10 parts per billion. Under the 2021 lead and copper rule revisions, the agency had introduced a new value referred to as the trigger level that had different actions that were triggered as a result of exceeding that level. The feedback we got was that created unnecessary complexity in the implementation of the rule, so we've eliminated that level and lowered the current action level down to 10 micrograms per liter. So and what that means is when water systems 90th percentile lead sampling results exceed this level, the system will still be required to notify the public. Actually, there is a 24-hour public notification required for systems that exceed the action level. They're going to have to install or adjust corrosion control, and they're going to conduct public education programs. The big difference now, of course, is since all systems have to replace their lead service lines, lead service line replacement is no longer triggered by the action level. Next slide, Patricia. So the LCRI is also going to be reducing exposure at homes through a number of things. And the first one I want to list here related to that last item is that systems that have multiple lead action level exceedances, and what we define multiple lead action level exceedances as being any system that exceeds the action level 3 times within a rolling 5-year period. So if a system has gone over and over the action level, in addition to the things that I mentioned that they have to do, once they've done that 3 times in a 5-year period, they're going to have to make filters available to their consumers as a means to reduce their exposure. They also will be required to provide filters following disturbance of lead service lines, either as a result of the actual replacement, which we're compelling, or if they're disturbing lead service lines as a result of normal or other unrelated construction, they're going to need to provide both public education and make available to them pitcher filters that are certified to reduce lead. Next slide, Patricia. All right, so more frequent and transparent communication is another critical aspect of the final lead and copper rule. What we've done is updated the information about health effects to make it more clear about the dangers of lead, of exposure to lead, and that information about health language will be included in both the regular consumer confidence reports that they get and the public education materials that they get, as well as in the notifications. We are also requiring water systems to proactively communicate to all of the households that have known lead service lines or galvanized requiring replacements or unknowns, letting them know that they have those sources of lead contamination and what the risks are and the actions that they can take, including participation in their lead service line replacement program. The consumer confidence reports are going to be providing information in addition to the improved health effects information that I mentioned. There is some testing that is required for school and childcare facilities. That's testing that was required in the last lead and copper rule revisions in 2021. So they're going to have to make the public aware of that lead testing and information about how they can find out more about that, as well as again, reminding the public of their ongoing lead service line replacement programs and the efforts that the system is taking to control corrosion in the system. Next slide. So we've taken a hard look at the benefits and costs of this rule. As many of you know, we are required under the Safe Drinking Water Act and under executive orders to do robust cost-benefit analyses. And what we found is really robust benefits associated with this proposed, or with this, I should say, final lead and copper rule. We have estimated that on an annual basis each year over the duration of our period of analysis, that the lead and copper rule improvements will protect up to 900,000 infants from being born at low birth weight, which obviously comes with greater risk of longer and more expensive hospital stays after birth. We think it's going to prevent up to 2,600 children each year from being from having attention deficit ADHD, attention deficit hyperactivity disorder. up to 1,500 cases of premature death from cardiovascular disease. That's probably one of the most significant advancements that we've identified within the benefits. Ryan Levin, I see you on the call, and thank you. We've prevented, we expect that we're presenting up to 200,000 IQ points in loss to children as a result of avoiding those neurodevelopmental impacts to children. Now, there are substantial costs, somewhere between $1.5 and $2 billion per year associated with implementing this, and that's, again, over the period of analysis. But the benefits far exceed them. They're up to 13 times greater than the estimated costs. Next slide. Recognizing that there are significant costs, we also have to point out that there is really unprecedented sources of funding available right now for support for water systems to conduct these lead service line replacements. Those include funding from the bipartisan infrastructure law. About 15 billion has been, not about, actually 15 billion has been dedicated over a 5-year period exclusively for lead service line replacement that comes through the Drinking Water State Revolving Fund. And then there is another almost $12 billion of funding that has also been will be added to the Drinking Water State Revolving Fund for any infrastructure improvements, including potentially lead service line replacement. The Water Infrastructure Improvement for the Nation Act also provides funds, particularly for schools and child care facilities, that will be instrumental to them taking follow-up action that could address any of the elevated levels of lead that those schools find. So next slide. So in addition to the funding, the agency has also recognized that many of the small and disadvantaged systems have had challenges getting access to that funding. So the agency in the last couple of years has stood up the water technical assistance, including specifically targeted programs like Get the Lead Out Initiative, to help those communities identify their lead service lines, develop their replacement plans, and most importantly, apply for the funding that they're going to need to get the lead out. We think this is really going to change the odds for the communities that have been facing those barriers, and will help them access that funding to achieve those lead service line replacements. Communities that are seeking access to the Get the Lead Out initiative can request assistance. The EPA's got a water TAA assistance request form on our website, and the links are there in that presentation. Next slide. So there are numerous resources that are available. There's just a few of them showing up on this slide. Numerous fact sheets that the agency's made available on some of the particular items that I've mentioned today. And the website that's on the next slide, why don't you go to the next slide, basically is your gateway to finding all of those materials. There's a lot of technical assistance materials out there that we think can be utilized by the states and water systems to take on the challenge of assuring effective public health implementation. With that, Walter, I'm going to turn things back to you so you can introduce our next speaker.
Walter, you're on mute.
Well, you would think that by now I would have figured that one out. Okay, so thanks very, very much, Eric, for that really informative presentation. We do have a number of questions in the chat. We're going to come back to those later on, but now we're going to turn and hear from Christine. Christine's going to talk about the lead in drinking water crisis in Newark, New Jersey, and how Newark, aided by other levels of government, county, state, and federal, did not become another Flint, Michigan. And I think most people recognize or are aware of what happened in Flint, where back in 2014, the city had changed its source water, and as a result, lead water pipes got corroded, and lead was getting into people's drinking water, and it was a pretty significant problem. So let's see if we can get this up. Is that showing on people's screens?
Yes.
Good.
I
Okay.
can see it. All right. Hi, everyone. Thanks so much for joining today. I am excited to be sharing a broad overview of my experience with the lead in drinking water crisis in Newark, New Jersey. Next slide, please.
Let's see if I can get it to advance. It's not advancing for me at the moment, so I'm going to try it a different way. There we go.
So I assume everyone knows that lead is bad for you. There's no safe level of lead exposure, and everyone knows that lead has been used in plumbing for a long time, and that it's more commonly found in older cities like Newark, New Jersey. Next slide, please. Newark, New Jersey is New Jersey's largest city and one of the oldest cities in the nation. It is also a diverse community with several environmental justice concerns, including a large economically disadvantaged population, limited English proficiency, and several sources of pollution, including trucks and traffic, combined sewer overflows, Superfund sites, an international airport, a port, an incinerator, among others. Next slide. So before I start discussing Newark, I'll go over some background on regulatory requirements for lead in drinking water. So under the lead and copper rule, water systems are required to treat their water with the chemical, for example, orthophosphate or silicate, that will react with the lead in plumbing to form an insoluble lining or scales on the inside of the pipes to prevent lead from dissolving into the water. Under the lead and copper rule, systems are also required to conduct compliance monitoring sampling by collecting tap samples from homes that are more likely to have lead in their plumbing. So these are called Tier 1 sites. And there are other tiers of sites and allowances for sampling at them, but I'm going to focus on Tier 1 for the purposes of this presentation. If the lead concentrations in 10% of the homes the system samples at are greater than 15 parts per billion, that is called a lead action level exceedance. Now, as Eric mentioned, the action level for lead will be changing to 10 parts per billion under the lead and copper rule improvements, but at the time of the Newark response, it was 15. And I want to note for the presentation that the lead action level is not health-based. It's a measure of the effectiveness of a system's corrosion control treatment. An action level exceedance is also not a violation of the lead and copper rule. However, an action level exceedance does trigger actions that must be taken by the drinking water system, such as issuing public notice to their customers. Not taking those actions following an action level exceedance is a violation of the LCR, lead and copper rule. Next slide. So in the city of Newark, drinking water is provided by the Newark Water Department, which is owned and operated by the city. Newark serves over 290,000 people, and in 2019 was known to have around 18,000 lead service lines. Newark water is divided into two sections or service areas, the Wanacue and the Pequannock. And the two surface areas used different corrosion control treatments. Wanacue used and continues to use orthophosphate, and Pequannock used sodium silicate. Sodium silicate was used because the Pequannock service area has an uncovered finished water reservoir, in other words, an uncovered reservoir that is used to store treated drinking water. And there were concerns that orthophosphate may result in harmful algal blooms, which could affect the quality of the finished water. The Newark lead in drinking water response, and what I'll be presenting over the next few slides, was focused on the Pequannock served side, so the yellow portion of the service area in the picture. Next slide. Newark had not had an action level exceedance for several years. However, following actions taken by the state and EPA, and I think in part influenced by what happened in Flint, though the New Jersey Department of Environmental Protection had started taking action before that happened, it was determined that Newark was not collecting compliance monitoring sampling at the correct sites. And in 2017, after sampling at Tier 1 sites as required by the lead and copper rule, Newark had an action level exceedance. Next slide. Now, as I'd mentioned, under the lead and copper rule, a system is required to take various actions after an action level exceedance, including assessing their corrosion control treatment and replacing lead service lines. So in early 2018, following their 2017 action level exceedance, Newark, and beginning from here, when I refer to Newark, that includes their contractor, who they hired to help evaluate their corrosion control treatment. So Newark sent some lead service line samples from the Pequannock service area to EPA's Office of Research and Development, or ORD for short. And ORD is the scientific research arm of EPA. And they were going to assess the effectiveness of the silicate corrosion control treatment by evaluating the scales inside the pipes. Newark also collected sequential samples of drinking water from those pipes, and shared the data with ORD. So sequential samples are essentially when you turn on the faucet, leave it running, and take consecutive samples so you can analyze the contaminants in the water associated with specific sections of the plumbing, including the lead service line if there is one. Okay, so the next slide. So in October of 2018, ORD notified Region 2, it was me actually, that samples they had from 2 homes in Newark had elevated lead levels, one at 148 parts per billion and another at 399 parts per billion. So remember, the action level is 15 parts per billion and that there is no safe level of lead exposure. So when I received these results, I immediately notified senior management. Walter was one of them. And the New Jersey I also notified the New Jersey Department of Environmental Protection as required by the Water Infrastructure Improvements for the Nation Act. Next slide. And that was kind of the moment when the Newark response began. So these pictures are just a snapshot from throughout the Newark response as an example. There was television and news coverage, and the Newark lead crisis even has its own Wikipedia page now. Next slide, please. So some of the questions that came up is, why are the lead levels high and how long have they been high? I already mentioned the incorrect sampling sites, but that may not have been the reason or the only reason. We learned that beginning in or around 2016, the pH of the system decreased from about 8 to about 7. Just as a reminder, pH is a measure of the acidity or basicity of an aqueous solution. Lower pH indicates acid, higher pH indicates base. So this decrease in pH made the water more acidic, in other words, more corrosive. And this likely had an impact on the effectiveness of the silicate. And that's the Pequonix corrosion control treatment chemical. ORD's analysis found that the scales on the inside of the lead service line samples Newark sent were not acting as an effective barrier to prevent lead from dissolving into the water. In addition, the lead levels we saw, for example, the 399 parts per billion, are typically a result of particulate lead in water, indicating that the lead scale that had previously formed in the pipes was breaking off and moving through the pipes versus dissolving. So I want to note that while we know when the pH change occurred, we don't know how long lead levels may have been elevated. They may have been elevated prior to 2017, but because the sample sites were incorrect, the higher levels were not detected. And before I move on to the next slide, I also just wanted to backtrack a little bit and talk about why the change in pH happened. So the Safe Drinking Water Act requires water systems comply with a variety of different rules. The lead and copper rule is just one of them. However, simultaneous compliance with all of the Safe Drinking Water Act rules requires a delicate balance in water chemistry, which can be difficult to maintain. Newark had difficulty complying with the Stage 2 disinfection byproducts rule, and typically there are less disinfection byproducts at lower pHs. However, corrosion control treatment chemicals are often more effective at higher pHs. Newark likely reduced their pH to try to comply with the disinfection byproducts, probably at the expense of lead and copper rule compliance. Another confounding factor, I'd mentioned that the Pequonix service area has an open finished water reservoir. Under the Safe Drinking Water Act surface water treatment rules, finished water reservoirs are required to be covered. Besides concerns with harmful algal blooms and bacterial contamination, maintaining consistent water chemistry can be more difficult with an open reservoir because of all the outside factors like precipitation and debris, etc. And Newark is working to cover its reservoir now. And just because things were not complicated enough, Newark also sells water to as many as 8 other drinking water systems, and at least one of those relied on Newark's corrosion control treatment for its own water supply. Others were treating their water, but the water could be affected by changes to Newark's water chemistry, so there were a lot of questions and concerns about how these consecutive systems might be impacted by this situation in Newark. So next slide, please. That was mostly an aside. I just wanted to highlight the complexities that Newark and other drinking water systems face, and also other issues that we had to grapple with during the response. But now I'll go back to lead in drinking water. So as I'd mentioned, EPA was notified about the lead levels in October of 2018, and within days, oh, go back, Walter.
Sorry,
Yeah.
There we go.
Okay, sorry. Within days, Newark had a free filter distribution program in place. Thousands of filters were donated to the city, and they also purchased filters for residents with lead service lines. The city set up distribution centers around Newark and had an outreach plan in place, both about free filters and also to notify residents about the city's lead service line replacement program. Newark also decided to switch the Pequannock service area's corrosion control treatment from silicate to orthophosphate and was getting organized for that transition. And New Jersey Department of Environmental Protection had issued an order to Newark to get them back into compliance. So as this was happening, things were, quote, quiet for a little bit, end quote. Next slide, please. All right. So in early May of 2019, Newark collected baseline sequential samples at 3 homes before the orthophosphate was added to the system. So the city is distributing filters at this point. They're under New Jersey's order that requires them to provide filters until the new corrosion control treatment, the orthophosphate, is shown to be effective. So pre-orthophosphate and post-orthophosphate samples were needed to show if the lead levels were coming down over time. Newark began adding orthophosphate to the system towards the end of May. Next slide, please. So the baseline lead levels, unfiltered, no orthophosphate, showed high levels of lead in the water samples collected from the lead service lines in 2 homes. One home had a total lead level of almost 800 parts per billion. And then people asked, are the filters able to remove that much lead? Looking more closely at the filters, which advertise 99% removal, the filters are certified for their level of lead removal based on laboratory testing with a specific test water with a concentration of 150 parts per billion lead. The amount of particulate lead, and I mean particulates of different sizes, and dissolved lead is set in this test water too. So in short, what the filters face in the field, real life situations like we saw in Newark, are not necessarily the conditions that they are tested with as part of their certification. Also, filters are not certified to reduce lead down to 0. It was 10 parts per billion, though I think it's been reduced to 5 now. So in June, Newark went to those 3 homes again for the sequential samples and collected both pre and post filter samples. Next slide, please. In July, the filtered samples at 2 of the 3 homes, one with a faucet filter and one with a pitcher filter, came back above the 15 parts per billion action level. So the lead concentration in the home with the faucet filter was 83 parts per billion and the pitcher filter was 34 parts per billion. So in other words, the filters failed. So this was kind of a big deal. The filters had been distributed for months to protect thousands of residents from exposure to lead in drinking water. And beyond Newark, lots of people rely on filters, including myself. So we needed to better understand what was going on. The first step was that New Jersey DEP, EPA, and Newark agreed to conduct confirmatory sampling. After talking with the sampling team some more, there was reason to believe that there may have been some human error involved that may have affected the filter's effectiveness. Just as an aside, there's a lot of human error in using filters, such as not installing them properly, not changing cartridges on time, filtering hot water, which can damage the filtration media, etc. Next slide, please. Newark gave the 2 homeowners bottled water and replaced their filters, making sure to install them properly, and confirmatory samples were collected in early August. The lead levels in the same filtered water samples from those 2 homes came back high again, above the 15 parts per billion action level and the filter's 10 part per billion removal rating. On Friday, August 9th, the regional administrator at that time sent a letter to Newark and the state asking that out of an abundance of caution, they provide drinking water to Newark residents until a larger analysis could be done. Next slide. And thus the filter effectiveness study began. Newark had teams out collecting water samples pre and post filters from homes beginning that same weekend. The filter manufacturer sent people into the field too. EPA was also contacted by organizations that certify the filters wanting to discuss our data in their certification process. And that Monday, we started daily technical meetings between EPA, the city, and the state. And this collaboration is a big part of why the response effort was ultimately a success. In these meetings, we worked together to develop a sampling protocol. We figured out how to select sample sites, and we discussed quality assurance and quality control. We would discuss the latest status of sampling efforts, as well as issues identified in the field and how to appropriately address them. So for example, how should the sampling teams adjust the protocol based on longer or shorter lead service lines encountered in the field? We also worked together to coordinate ramping up the number of samples that could be collected and analyzed. Everyone pitched in. EPA, New Jersey DEP, Newark, everyone contributed people to the field teams out sampling, and the sample analysis was shared between 3 labs: our Region 2 lab in Edison, New Jersey, the New Jersey Department of Health's lab, and the City of Newark's lab. And ramping up was important because some of the questions we were facing were, how many samples or how much data do we need to determine whether the filters are effective or not, and under what conditions? So for example, do we need 99% of the filters to remove lead to 10 parts per billion or less? Or do we need 97% of filters to remove lead to 15 parts per billion or less? What goal was good enough given that there is no safe level of lead? And we wanted to be able to tell residents how they could best protect themselves. Our Office of Research and Development was also engaged, looking closely at why the filters may have failed. And besides the filter study itself, EPA was dealing with press inquiries, congressional briefings, citizen concerns, FOIAs, how to notify residents of their sample results. We were having ongoing discussions with filter manufacturers, filter certifying organizations, and more. It was a very busy time. Next slide, please. All right, so sampling concluded the second week of September. Over 1,600 samples were collected from more than 300 households served by the Pequannock service area. Then came the filter effectiveness study report, which included the data analysis results and recommendations from the study. EPA, New Jersey DEP, and Newark worked collaboratively to finalize the report. And in the end, we agreed the data showed that 97.5% of filters removed lead to 10 parts per billion or less, the removal level the filters are certified to, when the filters were properly installed and maintained. This increased to 99.5% when the water was flushed for at least 5 minutes before filtering. So eventually everyone agreed that residents should flush water prior to filtering for at least 5 minutes and longer depending on the length of their service line, and then use a properly installed and maintained filter certified to remove lead. Next slide, please. So the final study was published on Newark's website on November 22nd, 2019, and I thought that it deserved its own slide. And again, I have to acknowledge Newark and the New Jersey Department of Environmental Protection as being partners throughout the experience. For me, as my partners, they were patient, collaborative, transparent, and they were truly committed to protecting the residents of Newark, as was EPA. Next slide, please. So what came after the filter study? Newark continued to conduct sequential sampling to monitor the effectiveness of the orthophosphate in the Pequannock service area. In this diagram, I hope you can see the lead levels are shown coming down over time. Newark also rapidly worked to replace all of the lead service lines in the city. And lead service line replacement in Newark was no small feat because none of the lead service lines were owned by the city. They were all owned by homeowners, which meant the city had to get permission from the homeowners to replace their lead service lines. Before the lead crisis began, the city of Newark had received Drinking Water State Revolving Fund money to cover the cost of some lead service line replacements and developed a program where homeowners had to pay $1,000 of the total cost of the replacement. However, in a city like Newark, $1,000 can be a lot of money, and so the city was having difficulty finding homeowners to sign up. After the lead in drinking water response began, the city received additional funding and began providing lead service line replacement to homeowners for free and conducted extensive outreach about the program, which was important to the program's success. EPA also had confirmed that drinking water state revolving funds could be used to fund the replacement of the privately owned side of the service lines, not just the part owned by the water system, which was important. And the city also passed an ordinance making lead service line replacement mandatory, enabling them to replace lines without homeowner permission. And what Newark did, both the sequential sampling and the lead service line replacement efforts, went beyond what was required by the lead and copper rule. Next slide, please. So in 2022, just over 3 years since the crisis began, Newark celebrated the conclusion of its lead service line replacement program. Nearly 24,000 lead service lines were replaced, and Newark became a national success story. And that's not the best picture, but Kamala Harris came and had a met with the city to celebrate the accomplishment. Next slide, please. So I thought I'd just share some of the national implications that were raised following the Newark response, and this is in no particular order. But first, the filter effectiveness study tested different types of filters in addition to the ones provided by the city, and some were found to be more effective at removing lead than others, which implies that if a system decides to provide filters to their customers, they may want to consider evaluating what type of filter should be given to provide the most protection, since water chemistry can affect filter effectiveness, and different brands use different technologies. We saw this happen with Denver Water, which tested filters before they gave them out to customers. Next, during the response, there were discussions about the filter certification process and if it should be reevaluated. Those discussions were underway at the time, but I'm not sure where they stand now. I need to check with ORD. Third, under the lead and copper rule, action level exceedances are calculated based on first draw sample, so the first liter of water taken from the tap, but data from Newark and other lead and drinking water response efforts demonstrated that the first draw sample may not be an accurate representation of lead in drinking water. Fourth, it was apparent that human error in using filters is rampant and that has implications for how protective they are for public health. Studies in Flint also showed human error issues in using filters too, so better outreach and education on filters is needed. And finally, funding for the lead service line replacements was an ongoing discussion, given the number of cities that need lead service line replacement and how expensive it is. I think it's somewhere in the billions of dollars needed to address the 6 to 10 million lead service lines in the country, estimated 6 to 10 million. Next slide, please. So where are we now? We've made a lot of progress over the last few years. Eric shared earlier the lead and copper rule improvements, which now requires the first and fifth liter samples to be collected and inform an action level exceedance calculation. And it also lowers the lead action level to 10 parts per billion, among other things. Also on funding, we've come a long way. As Eric mentioned, there's the bipartisan infrastructure law, drinking water state revolving fund. There's also technical assistance that EPA and the states are providing. And I just also wanted to add that with the bipartisan infrastructure law funding, that to use that money, the system has to do a full lead service line replacement, which was not required under the base drinking water SRF state revolving fund previously. And finally, EPA is continuing to develop resources, including improving outreach and engagement materials in different languages, such as public notification templates and tools for consumers on identifying and using filters. Again, some of what Eric mentioned. So next slide, please. And that's pretty much it. There were a lot of people to thank, including Walter. And looking back, I just wanted to say I consider myself fortunate to have been part of the effort, and it was incredibly challenging. But there were so many lessons learned from the experience, and I think it ultimately helped inform future decisions. So thank you. And I look forward to questions.
Thanks very, very much, Christina. I really appreciate that. We do have a number of questions that have gone into the chat, and I'm going to have a quick look at them, and I'll pose some of them. Let me start with Eric. This was one of the early questions that came in. Said the question is: lining lead pipes with non-toxic linings acceptable instead of replacing the pipe? And why or why not? I'm guessing that the question was talking about the lining that the chemical treatment creates inside the pipe, but maybe there's other elements to the question as well.
Well, Walter, I appreciate that question. It's a really good one. I'm interpreting that as some companies are out there, they have technologies with epoxy coating technologies and or sort of a slip lining where they pull a pipe through a pipe. The lead and copper rule improvements actually specifically said that was not an eligible thing that is not an eligible considered as a lead service line replacement. And the concern is the degree to which these technologies have been vetted for durability. And, will that coating remain in place? Have those technologies been fully evaluated to demonstrate that they'll remain there? as long as that lead service line replacement is still in place. Because if that coating goes away, then of course the water's in contact with the lead. So we have not considered that to be an adequate substitute for physically replacing the service line.
Thanks. Here's another one. How many cities actually achieved the October 16th deadline for providing the inventory of the lead service lines? And once they do that inventory, how is the public notified of that list? And finally, is there a minimum population requirement in place to be placed on such a list?
Yeah, so good questions. And I know this audience will appreciate my answer more than others, right? Because you understand the nature of primacy and the degree to which we have delegated these programs to the states, right? So there are 49 states that have primacy. For those of you who are interested, Wyoming is the only one that does not. So those reports went into the states, and then the states are busy evaluating those inventories, and the reporting to EPA will not actually take place until the springtime. So that's a long way of saying I don't know nationally what the percentage of that is. But the second part of your question is how's the public notified? Well, the water systems are required to make their inventory publicly available now. Systems serving 50,000 or more are required to make that available on their websites. So those of you that are served by a public water supply system that serves 50,000 or more people, you can check their website and it should be posted there. Those that are served by smaller systems are still subject to the requirement. They just don't have to post it online. So you can contact them or consult your next consumer confidence report to see where and how you get a hold of the inventory.
If I recall correctly, to be a public water supply system that is subject to the law, it's very, very small. It's only like 25 customers or some tiny number.
That's exactly right, Walter. So the Safe Drinking Water Act defines a public water supply system as one that serves 25 or more people or has 15 or more service connections.
Got it. So here's another question about the real ultimate results here. The questioner says, hey, blood lead levels in the US have dropped by about 90% over the last 2 decades. Actually, my recollection is that it's more like 95% since the mid-1970s. So it's an even more dramatic reduction. But in any event, is there any epidemiological evidence of large increases or any increases in IQ in the US because of this? That's a real challenging one.
Yeah, Walter, it comes from my friend and former colleague, Bruce Mackler from Region 9, I see. So hello, Bruce. Good to see you're still asking those tough questions. So Bruce, what I'll say is there are numerous epidemiologic studies that definitively tie lead exposure with decreased IQ decrements. The particular study that you're asking about, I'm not aware of. Of course, you know I'm not an epidemiologist. There's probably people on this call right now who might know the answer to it, but it seems to me intuitively, because IQ is something that is fit to the population. The IQ of 100 basically is the central tendency of the population. So that as the whole population's IQ shifts, the scale of the IQ is going to shift. So I'm not sure even how you would construct that study, but I'm not aware of any such national study about IQ decrements of the entire US population, but I am certainly aware of numerous studies that have epidemiologic studies have carefully evaluated population cohorts to compare those that are exposed to lead and not exposed to lead. And they definitely can see a significant impact on IQ in those children.
So actually, Chuck asked this question. It says, it seems that many people believe that the only people at risk are children, which we know is not the case, but will the required health information emphasize that there are also adverse effects for adults? And will it also encourage people to use filters where they have a known or unknown service line? So a couple of questions there to unpack.
Yeah, great questions, Chuck. So yes, as I emphasized in my presentation, we obviously talk about the health risks to pregnant lactating women and to infants, but it is important to note that we both have quantified the benefits associated with avoided exposure to adults, particularly in the cardiovascular disease, and the public health language that has to be included in the public education and the notifications, and in the consumer confidence reports also highlights those risks to adults as well. As for your question about filters, yes, the public education materials that the water systems must send when they exceed the action level includes requiring them to talk about the proper use of filters, picking up on Christine's question, the proper use of filter, or not question, her statement about the experience in Newark, the proper use of filters to reduce drinking water lead exposure, as well as other things such as flushing their lines, and things like not using hot water, encouraging regular cleaning of aerators. So there's numerous things, actions recommended to consumers, including filters, that users can take to reduce their exposure to lead.
Thanks. And we got a comment, but I think we can all agree it was a big achievement to get this funding for the lead service line replacements in the bipartisan infrastructure law. And yeah, absolutely, it was a terrific achievement. Christine, this one I think is for you. Now we're talking about the experience in Newark. Somebody asked, did the pH levels vary by time of year? Any relationship there, as far as we know?
Not that I recall, it was generally around 8, and then it transitioned generally to be around 7. It's not, a stagnant number all the time, but no, it wasn't weather related.
Got it. And another question, what was wrong with the sampling sites or the sampling techniques that Newark had been using previously? And were the criteria they used regarding the sampling or the sampling sites unclear or ambiguous?
Yeah, so under the lead and copper rule, if a system has homes that have lead service lines and meet other criteria, that's where they should prioritize conducting their compliance monitoring sampling. However, there are different sites. There might be newer homes that don't have lead service lines that could be included in the sample pool, or newer homes with unknowns, or older homes. So they have to select where they think they will see the highest potential level of lead in the system. And Newark had selected, was using sites that were not within that pool of tier 1 sites that I mentioned. I'm not sure exactly why. I think something that we see sometimes happen is, they develop a sampling pool, and then a home replaces its lead service line, but then it's not removed from the sampling pool. They continue to go there, so they may not get the most, it may not be a tier 1 site anymore, but the data is still counted towards compliance monitoring. Or in some cases, homeowners opt out of participating in sampling, so a city doesn't have access to as many tier 1 sites. So there's a lot of different factors that could come into play.
And here's another one. How do water supply systems determine which service lines are lead and which aren't? And ultimately, the question is, for the purpose of determining that, do they have to dig them up? But maybe you can just unpack that a little bit for us.
Eric, you want to take that one?
I will, Christine, and you can supplement. How's that? So first of all, the agency has a guidance on conducting the inventories, and that particularly identifies using records review. So there are a lot of communities in which lead bans went into place as of a certain date. As a matter of fact, under the Safe Drinking Water Act was amended in 1986. And by 1988, that went into effect such that there were no, lead service lines were no longer allowed. Some communities, some states implemented lead bans. So that's frequently, so then by taking the housing age and determining whether or not it's before or after the date of the lead ban, that's one of the more frequent ways that water systems will determine whether or not a service line is lead. And then, of course, you can't be guaranteed that if it was constructed before that date, it is lead. And so records are often used by water systems. Sometimes there's things called tap cards and other things. Sometimes those records are reliable, sometimes they're not. One of the new technologies that's coming out is machine learning. It's another name for AI, right? So these models have been started developing to try and gather all of the data and then try and predict whether or not they're lead service lines. And what we specified in the LCRI is when they use some of these new innovative approaches to identify whether or not they're non-lead or they're lead service lines, they're going to have to validate that. You can't just use one of these AI models and just assume that it is accurate. You'll have to validate, and yes, you'll need to dig it up, or maybe dig it up. Sometimes you can actually look in the meter box, look in the basement, and you got to get eyes on it in 2 places to figure out whether or not it's a non-lead line to validate that. And what we're saying is you don't have to do that for every site, but you got to sample enough to have a 95% confidence that the lines that you've identified as non-lead are actually non-lead.
Back to you, Christine. In the Newark case, do we know whether they tested blood lead levels in children or others at all in conjunction with all of this work? My recollection is that the answer is no, that there is a lead testing or blood testing program generally in effect for children, but that they didn't do it specifically as part of this particular crisis reaction. Am I right about that? Is that your recollection?
Yeah,
Okay.
yeah, that's correct.
And then you talked about the additional municipalities that are served by that Newark provides to these other downstream municipalities. Had there been similar monitoring at some of those municipalities, and did they identify similar concerns?
I do remember one of them had a number of them asked questions while we were doing the response. Some of them were dealing with an action level exceedance of their own. A lot of them were asking for funding to help replace their lead service lines or struggling with unidentified or unknown service lines. But they're all working towards developing their inventories and having the lead service lines replaced now.
Right. And here's a question: what happens to the actual lead service lines once they're replaced? When they dig up the lead, what do they do with it? I have no idea. I don't know. Does anybody here on the call know? I assume
So,
it gets sent to a secondary to recycling or something like that.
yeah,
A secondary
so
lead smelter.
Walter, what I can say is, once the lead line is removed from the public water supply system, it's no longer a part of the public water supply system or subject to the Safe Drinking Water Act. RCRA
Right.
could come into play here. So it could be a hazardous material and subject to the disposal requirements there. However, there are scrap recycling
Yeah.
provisions that could come into play. We are encouraging all the water systems to dispose of it responsibly, and if they are going to have it recycled, please, do that in a way that minimizes lead exposure.
Yep. Here's somebody's asking, say, hey, they apparently they live in the city of New York, and they got an email from their water provider. Well, I think it's the city, informing them that they have lead pipes. And the question is the bill funding, the bipartisan infrastructure law funding, available for individual homeowners to replace their lead lines, or is the funding just for municipalities? Eric, I don't know,
Christine, do you want to take that, or shall I?
either one?
Yeah, so the SRF funding, it has to be awarded to municipalities, but the municipalities can then use that funding to replace lead service lines for individuals and individual homes that they serve. So if the New York City receives SRF funds, they would be able to use them to replace your lead service line.
And is that true whether or not the homeowner is low income? Even if it's not a low income person, are they eligible for that funding support?
So
Go ahead.
So the states prioritize their allocations of funding, and obviously there are incentives for them to fund those communities with disadvantaged populations first.
Yeah.
Christina, you said communities, but obviously it's public water supply system. So even if they're privately owned, under the federal rules anyway, they could be eligible for these funds too. But it's a public water system that is eligible for it, and whether or not it's owned by the municipality. And then just to enhance what Christine said, a system is not eligible if they only replace the public portion, right? That is not an eligible expense. They got to replace the whole line, right? Now, how they charge ultimately their customers for this is sort of a matter of state and local law, but it's pretty clear that if you're going to use funding, we strongly encourage them to use it to replace. They have to use it to replace the entire line, and we strongly encourage them to provide that, particularly for low and disadvantaged households, at no cost to those customers.
Thanks. So we are at 5 o'clock right now. We have, just as far as I can see, only 2 or 3 more questions. Some of them are a little bit more of a conversation, but if we can go for another minute or two, I'll try and pose those last couple of questions, and I'll just have a few closing remarks right then. The next question was, well, the commenter says, hey, the information about the failure of the filters was very disturbing, because a lot of people use them and they just assume they work. And it's sort of a follow on what you were talking about, Christine, Eric, what kind of information program should be put in place to let people know, but also what do people do when they get warned that their filter may not be working? And that's, a challenging question. Any thoughts?
I mean, I guess I will offer that I think Newark was an exceptional case in the levels of lead that we saw, and the different situation we were dealing with, the different sizes of lead, and the ORD was looking at lead phosphate nanoparticles. There was a lot of stuff in play. I think filters are generally you can generally rely on filters as long as you use and maintain them according to the manufacturer's requirements. But I'll let Eric add too.
No, I'll agree. I don't think the conclusion of the certainly the conclusion of the Newark study was not that filters don't work. The conclusion of
Yeah.
filters is they're very effective. Obviously, they're more effective when they're used in accordance with the manufacturer's recommendations. I will validate, the Q statistic that is used to certify them by the ANSI NSF certifiers has been strengthened. And I think there's still ongoing work on this microparticulate issue, which may very well be, it's really not certain how pervasive that is if that's a transitional thing when systems are converting to orthophosphate, as was the case in the Newark system. But we have high degree of confidence in the efficacy of these filters, with the understanding they got to be used correctly, which is a part of the instructions and education we're going to be requiring water systems to use when they distribute them.
There's a little bit more back and forth on the IQ question, but I'm going to take the liberty of skipping over that and go to this last question. Are there existing cities today that are having trouble meeting the new law? And I presume by that we mean the standards of the new reg.
Well, so the way the Safe Drinking Water Act works is water systems have 3 years from the date that we promulgate the final rule. So water systems aren't required to come into compliance with this rule until November of 2027. So I can't tell you whether or not, we know that there are many water systems that are very concerned about the burden, the costs of this. And so there certainly are lots of comments in the docket, 200,000 comments, as a matter of fact, on the proposed rule, many of which were from water systems saying that this is going to be very challenging for us to meet.
So my final comment is that Newark had expected to be able to replace all of their lead service lines in 10 years. They did it in about 3. That was an extraordinary effort, again, with federal, state, and county support, monetary support. One of the big takeaways that Christine mentioned is that Newark made it free. The homeowner did not have to contribute to the cost, but Newark also made it mandatory, so they couldn't say no. And they had a really robust outreach program to help take trusted local persons who were known in the community to really advocate that people should be supporting all of this. So on behalf of the Alumni Association, I really extend my very sincere thanks to Eric and Christine for this timely and fascinating presentation. So whoever's on, can you join me in giving them a virtual round of applause?